We're in for a special treat this morning. Steve Oss is the keynote speaker this morning. Steve is the Assistant Director of the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, an applied research group for the state of Washington that reports directly to the state legislature in Washington. He doesn't look it, but he's been 31 years involved in this work. His primary focus is on assessing the costs and benefits of different kinds of programs. And for our purposes, of course, his work is cost-benefit work with respect to the effects of violence, drug, and delinquency prevention programs and intervention programs is probably, from my perspective, the best cost-benefit data we have for these kinds of programs. More recently, he's now involved with the state legislature in looking at K-5 educational programs as well. Again, looking at cost and benefits of that program. He has many years of experience in this area looking at policy implications, not only in these two areas we've already mentioned, but experience also in the area of energy economics and regulatory policy. He has worked for the Washington State Budget Office, Seattle City Light, the Northwest Power Planning Council, the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and he has his own consulting firm where he did have his own consulting firm, maybe that's still going on, where he wrote a newsletter on Washington State's economy. He received his MS degree from the University of California at Irvine. Steve's work is really important work with the effort of convincing state legislators, funders to invest in prevention programming and in evidence-based programming. And we really rely heavily upon his work to demonstrate the benefits and the costs of this program. So it's my privilege to introduce to you for this morning's keynote, Steve Oss.
Well, thanks everybody, and good morning. I hope everyone's cheerful and ready to hear an economist talk about this stuff. You know, if we could go to the PowerPoint here, the title, I've decided to change the title of my slide. It's how is your, in light of what's going on in the stock market, I said, how is your portfolio doing? And while you might think I might want to talk to you about your individual stocks and bonds, we aren't going to talk about those, but we are going to be talking about your portfolio. We're going to be talking about going from what we've been talking about, I think, so far around in the topics here today, looking at individual blueprints or evidence-based programs. And where we're going to go this morning is we're going to say, if we did a bunch of that stuff, where could your state end up collectively? If we did a whole portfolio of these programs, what kinds of outcomes that might motivate your legislature or others, it certainly has motivated the Washington legislature, to action, what would those portfolios look like? And what kinds of effects would they have? So that's where we're going to get to in a moment. There is this thing between individual and the collective. And one of my favorite musical things is the theater of Gilbert and Sullivan. And maybe many of you know those plays. They were written over 100 years ago, poking fun at the British aristocracy for the most part. And their plays are known, Mikado, HMS Pinafore, and the one that they know best known for is The Pirates of Penzance. And The Pirates of Penzance, you couldn't have had Johnny Depp in the Pirates of Caribbean if 100 years ago you hadn't had the Pirates of Penzance. They sort of laid the groundwork for the sort of the comic version of piratedom. All that stuff that we do now, you know, matey, it's a good day for plundering, all that stuff, started with Gilbert and Sullivan 100 years ago. So you know the story, the plot. It's a simple one. Our hero is a guy named Frederick, and he's turning 18 years old. And as a youngster, Frederick had been apprenticed, a very young child, had been apprenticed to a band of pirates, the Pirates of Penzance. Actually, he was supposed to be apprenticed to a pilot, but the nursemaid, Ruth, had bad hearing, and so she interpreted pilot as pirates, so she found a band of pirates to apprentice him to. So he's now turning 18 years old, and he decided he really wants to leave this group of pirates. And so in a famous speech early in the musical, he comes up to him and he says, "Individually, I love you all with an affection unspeakable, but collectively, I look upon you with a disgust that borders on absolute detestation." So Frederick was kind of onto something here. He said that he was onto something that individually you might like things, but collectively, what do we think about it? In the United States, we have that same reaction about our congressmen. We dutifully elect and re-elect our congresspeople. The incumbents have an enormous advantage in re-election, but collectively, we regard Congress as a very low status of probability of good things happening event. So we have this dilemma between what we think individually and what we think collectively, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. These blueprint programs, these evidence-based programs, what do we think about them individually, but more importantly, what do we think about them collectively as a group of things? What could we do with them to make some real effects in our states? So we're going to talk about that. Just Dell mentioned this, the institute that I work for, it's a nonpartisan group. We're not affiliated with any of these programs, except insofar as we write recommendations to our legislature. That's what we're asked to do. All the work that we do, every single project that we do, comes to us because the legislature writes it into a law, and then we go forth and do the study. The study, in fact, I'm talking about today was ordered up in the 2005 legislature. There's Olympia. That's our little state capital and one of the many, 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 many sunny days that we have in Olympia. The Capitol building is right there. We're looking north up Puget Sound there. Olympic National Park is on the left there, Seattle on the right. The Institute for Public Policy is right there, pretty close to the Capitol, and my house is right there. I've got what you call a low carbon footprint because I get to walk to work every day. And so the importance there is not to see my house where I'll be tonight, but what we feed things directly into this state capitol. That's the object of my work. I'm delighted that people around the country have picked up on it a little bit, but our object is to try to feed information, Consumer Reports kind of information, into that legislature so that on the margin at least some decisions can be made that use taxpayers' dollars more effectively to accomplishing some statewide outcomes. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have a couple themes. Individually, we're going to try to take a look at what works and what doesn't. We've got those lists. Dale talked about them yesterday. We'll talk about them a little bit today. We'll talk about then what's economic, because we've tried to take it one step farther. I found that legislators, at least in my legislature, like cost-benefit information. They like to know. It helps them bring two parties together. It helps them bring the fiscal conservatives of both parties together, which are the majority of members of our legislature. And then we'll talk about the important thing, I think, of collectively, because this is what we've looked at for our legislature, and they've been using this information. What would it look like in Washington? What would crime rates look like? What would the need to build prisons look like? What would the total amount of money that we have to spend on the criminal justice system look like if we did a range of these programs, some of which are being talked about here at this conference, and some of them are other kinds of programs as well. And then we'll talk about some policy decisions that have been made in Washington, how this information was used, and what I think are some of the next steps ahead that we need to do now that our state, Washington, has made some decisions. What do we need to do to make sure these things actually happen? The take-home message, I was talking to Mark Lipsey about this yesterday. I didn't change this. Mark suggested this is a take-home message. It was already in my slide, so I didn't steal it from Mark. The take-home message, if there is one simple message, is that the power of compound interest. When you were a child, probably, I hope your mother or father told you about, if you just save a little bit and you save it year after year, you may not get great rates of returns, but if you let these things grow over time, by the time you get to be my age, which actually is older than Dell otherwise indicated. By the time you get there, you can have a fair amount of money because of compound interest. Interest compounds on itself. And that's what I learned most, I think, from doing the analysis that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. If you do some of these programs, the successful ones, and you do them over and over again with each successive cohort of kids or each successive cohort of adults that are releasing from prison, each successive group of kids that might be eligible for a nurse-family partnership, for example, if you do those over and over again and you draw out the numbers, you can have quite a cumulative effect of that, just like your mother's admonition about compound interest. You can have quite an accumulative effect on that. So the effect sizes may be small. I think Dell mentioned this yesterday, but doing them over and over again, when you do the numbers, I think you'll see has quite an effect on key outcomes of interest. So let's do a little bit of background stuff for a couple numbers that we need. Economists have to do graphs. We're going to do a couple graphs. This is going to be adult prison incarceration rates. Boy, these P's pop here. When I was younger, I played in rock and roll bands and things like that, and you usually had to put stuff up there to try to avoid that happening. Unless you wanted it in grunge rock, you really wanted that to happen a lot, but that was after my time. So I've got prison incarceration rates plotted up there from 1930 to 2005. And so the incarceration rate's pretty simple. It's just the number of people that you have incarcerated on any given day divided by some group of people. And so here I've taken all the adults. All the adults, we're going to look at Washington numbers and we're going to look at the United States numbers. These are the same kind of numbers that the Pew released a week or so ago in terms of rates. Here's the rates for the United States. Incarceration rates, and I'll put the Washington rates up as well. So we can see from this chart that for decades, really from 1930 when they first started having these numbers reported nationally, up through 1980, we had about 2 people per 1,000 adults locked up. And it was the same in Washington roughly as it was in the United States. So a lot of things happened during those decades. The Depression happened, World War II happened, the Beatles happened, Elvis Presley happened, the Vietnam War happened, the internet had not happened yet, but what we had there was about 2 people, pretty consistent policy of how much of our population we're going to lock up on any given day. And then starting in the 80s, we can see what happened in the United States rates, and we can see what happened in Washington rates. Washington rates also went up, but at a rate much slower than the national average. So today we have about 10 people per 1,000 or 1 people per 100 locked up nationally on average across the states. There's great variation in the states. Washington is one of the lower incarceration states. Also plotted on that chart was the forecast that our official state forecast of where we were going to be on our incarceration rate in the years ahead out to 2020, and that was from the December 2006 forecast. Talk about December 2006. Our report that I'm going to talk about today came out in October 2006. The 2007 legislature used it. They were using it a year ago when they were in session, and they made quite a few additions and modifications as a result of the work that we did. And so we'll talk about what's going to happen to that forecast as a result, we think will happen as a result of what was adopted in the thing. So we have quite an increase in the rate of incarceration as sort of a main policy choice around the United States. One other piece of background let's take a look at, and that is crime rates and taxpayer costs. This is big picture stuff. We can only go back here to 1980 out to 2005. I have 2006 data now, but I don't have it on this chart. Let's take a look at this little chart here. We'll look at how things have changed since 1980. And I've got, like every economist, you're going to have good news and bad news. And so the good news is that crime rates are down. These data are for Washington State, but they're similar to data around the country. In general, crime rates have declined since 1980. These are the Part 1 kinds of crimes that get reported to the police. They include most of the felony offenses that are common to all states, and property offenses and violent offenses. So if you came to Washington today, you have about a 25, 26, 27% less chance of being a victim of one of those serious crimes than had you visited Seattle back in 1980. So that's the good news. Crime rates are down. The bad news is how much money we taxpayers are spending on the criminal justice system. So what I've done here is I've taken all the money that Washingtonians are spending on our criminal justice system, all the way from police at the local level, local courts, local juvenile courts, local adult courts, the criminal parts of those courts that handle offender cases, judges' costs, the bailiffs' costs, all that stuff, public defenders' costs, prosecutors' costs, all the way through the local juvenile and adult sanctions and the state prison and state juvenile system. Added up all those dollars, take inflation out because you don't want to have that in there. So these are in 2005 dollars, and then divide by the number of households so we can get some kind of measure of that. And what you see is that we've had almost 100% increase in the real per capita, per household expenditures on the criminal justice system over that same time period. We now spend about $1,100 per household on that system, whereas we used to spend about $589 per household. Now, mostly what we bought in Washington with that increased money have been those prison beds that we saw a minute ago. We'd also have more police on the street, and in more recent years, we've started to invest in some more programming that we think is also reducing the crime rate. So those are the three main drivers, but the main driver of driving that line up there has been the prison expansion that we've had in our state. And since our state's prison expansion is probably less than your state's prison expansion, if we did a similar set of numbers for your state, there probably would be even more extreme on those curves. The question would be, here we are in Denver, it's a wonderful place to be here. If we could meet again in 10 years, and if I were your speaker then, I'd like to be able to tell you what had happened to those two lines. Something's going to happen to them. They're not random events. And what we would like to put in place in Washington are the policies that would at least keep the crime rate stable, if not going down. But what we found when we did the study is that we have some choices in terms of what resources we deploy. We can deploy a portfolio that's going to leave us on a continuing upturn in those expenditures per household, or we can find some outcomes and some portfolios of resources that are going to reduce the costs of the criminal justice system while keeping crime rates down. So those are the ones that we want to, those are the big pictures that we want to try to take a look at here as we go through this information. So when we started to look at this, we kind of put things into three buckets, three evidence-based public policy levers to affect crime. And I'm going to talk about public policies here now. A lot of what affects crime rates are the things we do in our private lives, how we raise our children, the kind of culture that we accept and buy and purchase and promote and so on. Those are not things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to talk about the kinds of public policy levers that are typically pulled in a place like Olympia, Washington, the state capital, or in cities across the states. And I put them into three buckets. The incarceration bucket, which would include prison, jails, juvenile detention, where you lock, your goal is to lock people up. Hiring police is another main crime-fighting goal that we can think about. And then programs. Programs including all the ones that we were talking about here, adult offender programs, juvenile offender programs, a variety of different programs, the K-12 programs that we do there. We know that all three cost money. One of the sad things and why economists are viewed as negative sorts is because we always remind people that nothing's free. There's no free lunch after all. We'd love free lunch. You can't get free lunch. Everything costs money. Prisons cost money. Those programs cost money. Police cost money. So we have to think about them as economic opportunities to reduce the crime rate. And we do find that there's evidence-based, solid evidence that all three can be effective or ineffective, depending on how you use them, to affect the crime rate in your state. If you use prison wisely, you can affect the crime rate in the state. We'll talk about that in a minute. Certain kinds of policing can affect crime rates, and certain kinds of programs can affect crime rates as well. So all three work, and that's why I think you really need to think about what kind of portfolio of those are going to give you the best bang for your buck, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, I won't talk about policing today because we haven't been asked to do that by our legislature. That's primarily a local government operation, but we will be talking about prisons, the programs, and then, of course, the portfolio. I need to go the other way. So we're going to talk about prison here. This is a conference about blueprints, about juveniles. And so you might wonder, why the heck are we talking about prison? Well, because it turns out that if you follow what goes on in your state capitals, prison is the primary thing that these programs are trying to avoid. And I'll provide the evidence for that in a minute. But it's certainly the major competitor as a crime-fighting resource in the eyes of many of the people that are in our state legislatures. So we need to talk about that resource. And the first question that always comes up is, does prison affect the crime rate? And that's the question that we're going to talk about here. And just right now, we think it does affect the crime rate. We're going to do a little chart here. I'll talk that same crime rate that we just looked at a minute ago. Those are the FBI crime rates per 1,000 people. And across the bottom, we'll take a look at that same incarceration rate that we talked about a minute ago. And these are going to be the raw data. When we actually do the analysis, I do a full econometric study, including all kinds of variables here, but these are just the raw data. If you think, theoretically, if you think that prison doesn't work to affect the crime rate, then you would expect to see the actual data pretty much a flat line, maybe a flat line. You might even think it goes up. I don't know, but no matter how the state adjusts its incarceration rate, it would have no effect on the crime rate if you think that prison doesn't work to affect the crime rate. If, on the other hand, you go into it thinking that prison is really an effective crime-fighting resource, then we would expect to see a pretty steep rate there. That is, even a small change in the incarceration rate would have a big effect on the state's crime rate. So let's take a look, as in most things, truth seems to be somewhere in the middle, and let's take a look at the data that Washington exhibits. Here's where Washington was back in 1980, if you remember those earlier charts. We had an incarceration rate of about 2 people per 1,000 along the bottom axis there, and our crime rate was about 70 serious crimes, those Part 1 kinds of crimes, per 1,000 people. As we began to increase the incarceration rate during those early 1980s, the crime rate started to go down. And then we adopted some sentencing reforms in the state of Washington in the mid-1980s. And when we did that, we actually reduced our incarceration rate, and the crime rate began to go back up. And then every year since 1988, we've been increasing our incarceration rate, and the crime rate has gone down. And so you can fit a line to that. Again, I do an econometric analysis where we use fixed, for those researchers in the audience, panel data for counties over time, fixed effects model, controlling for quite a number of covariates that we have. And we find that an elasticity here is that about a 10% change in your average incarceration rate will lead to a 2 to 4% change in your crime rate. Those are the numbers that we got for Washington State. The best studies that have been done around the country, I've reviewed all that research literature, comes up with roughly that same elasticity for the average kinds of incarceration, for the average kinds of crime. We've actually used those numbers and looked at it in terms of the elasticities for looking at violent offenders and drug offenders and property offenders. But the main point from this is that you can lower your crime rate if you want to by building more and more prison cells. In the end, if you put 100% of the people in prison, everybody is in prison, then the crime rate that we know it as we measure it by the police would be 0. On the other hand, if we let, in our state we have about 18,000 people in prison today, if we let all those people out today so that we had a 0% incarceration rate, a 0 up there, we know just from simple recidivism numbers how many more crimes we're likely to have next year. So our crime rate would go up if we had a 0%. So somewhere along that curve you want to be. But the important thing I hope your eye is catching is that curve has a curve to it. It's not a straight line. And that's a very important thing if you're trying to think about this concept of how much prison do you need in your state to control the crime rates. That implies that there's diminishing returns, something that economists, again, why we're considered to be a gloomy sort of people, because what we say with diminishing returns is that parties don't go on forever. Good things come to an end, and diminishing returns implies that as well. Home prices couldn't go on forever upwards. They had to crash at some point. And the more you're doing something, the smaller your added benefit. So we're going to do another chart here. And before we do the prison chart, let's take a look at Starbucks. Here's the number of Starbucks stores in downtown Denver. Now, it turns out that depending on how far you draw the radius, right now there are about 18 Starbucks stores in an area pretty close to where we're sitting today. couple miles radius of downtown. 18. So let's pretend you're Howard Schultz. You're the CEO now again, as well as the chairman of Starbucks. You have to decide how many Starbucks stores do we put into a geographic area like downtown in Denver. He's decided 18 is the right number. Why did he decide that? Why didn't he put one store in downtown Denver? Why didn't he put 180 stores? Why did he settle in on 18? And it's because diminishing returns affects his business. So if we look at the profit per new store added in downtown Denver, what's going to happen? What he's going to face is a curve that looks like that. As he adds more and more stores, new stores into this little area downtown Denver, the profit that he's going to add with each successive store is going to go down. There's still going to be people that are going to come in and buy coffee, so he's still going to bring in some money, but at some point, the cost of opening and running that new store is going to exceed the extra amount of money that he can do that, and he's stopped right now at about 18, so that's his cost curve. He's stopped at about 18 stores right now in downtown Denver, and he does that because he's trying to maximize the profit of people that own Starbucks stocks, of which I own some. So that's a clear thing. Now let's take a look at the same concept, but apply it to our prison population. Here's prison and diminishing returns, and we get the same effect. Prison industry is no different than the Starbucks industry. There's our incarceration rate again. There's our crimes avoided per new prison bed that we decide to build. Again, these data are for Washington State, and here are our estimates of that curve for Washington. So when we were first beginning to expand our incarceration rate back in 1980, when our curve was first going up, we think that given our model that we were with each additional prison bed per 1,000 population, we were reducing about 50 or 60 of those significant crimes, felony kinds of crimes, per added prison bed. But diminishing returns has clearly set in, and as we add more and more prison beds, as our incarceration rate goes up, we're solving fewer and fewer crimes as we go ahead. So that now we're avoiding about 10 crimes per average new prison bed. Many of those are going to be property crimes, larceny. Occasionally there are going to be some violent crimes in there as well. So the economics of prison is going to go down. When you're avoiding 50 or 60 crimes, probably prison's going to look like a lot better, more attractive option for you than when you're only avoiding 10 crimes per prison bed. So other resources begin to look better. It's sort of like when the price of gasoline goes up, hybrid cars, solar power cells start looking a lot better. Well, as the economics of prison have gotten worse and worse, as we get less and less return per building a new prison cell as a crime-fighting resource, what we find is that the economics don't look as good. So we're going to take a look now at what works. We're going to be talking about the individual stuff before we do the collective thing. And here's our approach. It's a simple approach. We looked at all the literature. We did meta-analysis of all kinds of programs in the adult system, in the juvenile system, and in the prevention system. We tried to take a look at especially programs that were real-world programs, not ones that weren't done in a university setting but were actually in operation. We ranked those higher than programs otherwise. And we also ranked programs that had rigorous research designs the best. Dale talked about this yesterday. We love random assignment studies, especially when they're carried out fully. We also put some quasi-experimental comparison group studies into our analysis as well. We downgraded those results because I think the general direction of the selection bias for criminal justice outcomes is going to be that you're going to overestimate the effectiveness of programs on average if you don't do that. So we reduced some of our effect sizes from quasi-experimental studies. We then asked the economic question. We said, okay, well, if these programs can have an effect on a crime rate, and that was the outcome we were looking at here, not other outcomes, substance abuse outcomes, those are also important, but we were looking at the crime outcomes. If we can get if those programs, any program that has an effect on the crime rate, then we asked the economic question. We said, what's it worth to us in Washington State to reduce crime? What's it worth to us? And we looked at two kinds of benefits. The taxpayer benefit, we saw those taxpayer costs a minute ago. So if we can reduce the crime rate, we can reduce the number of crimes that are going to be processed in that criminal justice system, and on a marginal cost basis, that's going to avoid us some money that we don't have to spend in the future as taxpayers. So we added up, we got a model that goes through and predicts that. And then, of course, if there are fewer crimes, there are also going to be fewer crime victims. So we used the work of Mark Cohen and Ted Miller to help us quantify and monetize, if you will, the value to crime victims of not becoming a victim of crime. So those are the two, when I look at benefits in a second here, they include both taxpayer benefits and crime victim benefits when crime is reduced. And then the third thing we did in this approach, we had done a little bit of this work, the first two steps, in earlier years. But what we did in 2006 that was the new kid on the block is we then did the portfolio thing that I talked about a minute, the collective thing. Where would Washington be if we took an investment kind of approach to how we fund programs in the state of Washington? So we looked at a current level, a moderate, and an aggressive portfolio and passed that information on to the legislature. So there, you can't read that, of course, but our consumer reports list is in our report. We're going to talk about a few of the programs that are on that list. This is the individual. This is Frederick looking at the individual pirates and deciding he loves some of them. This is our list of the individual merits of each of these programs. So here's a couple of them. Some selected results. Changes in crime are the outcome that we're looking at here. We'll look at some adult offender programs. We're not talking about that at this conference, but we are talking about reducing crime in Washington, so we wanted to consider adult offender programs, juvenile offender programs, and some prevention programs as well that have measured crime as an outcome. And we focus on juveniles, even though our main interest, the legislative interest, was how to avoid building prison, because we did a little quick study, and we found out that about 73% today, 73% of the adults that are in Washington prisons today had been in our juvenile justice system. So that's an opportunity. If we had been able to do something with those kids when they were juveniles to get them off of a life of crime, we might have been able, and we think we could have been able, to avoid having them in the adult correction system. So a very important thing to think about. If you're thinking about the problem we have in public sector, certainly the problem we've always had and continue to have in Olympia, is that we got these silos. We always talk about silos, right? When we're thinking about prison, you think about the adult correction system. That's even sometimes in a different committee of your legislature. And then if you're thinking about the juvenile justice system, you've got probably a different committee of your legislature. In our legislature, at least in the Senate, they're in the same committee. But we really need to break down those silos if we want to put together a rational portfolio. You got to think, if you're trying to think about avoiding prisons, what we'll talk about in a minute, you really do need to think about the juvenile offender programs and the prevention programs. If you just focus on adult offender reentry, you're not going to make too big a dent on your state's need for prison space. Some dent, but not a big dent. So let's take a look at a couple adult offender programs just as an example. Here's adult drug courts. This is very popular around the country. It's also popular among researchers. Here's what those numbers are. We found 57 studies, 57 drug court studies that had comparison groups that were reasonably well matched, enough so that we wanted to include them in our meta-analysis. Done mostly in the United States, some of them conducted outside the United States. Oops. And on average, we found across those 57 studies that they reduced the adult offender recidivism rates for the offenders that went through drug court by 8%. And I got some numbers up there, so that without a drug court, an offender in Washington, we think, has about a 58% chance of being reconvicted for a felony or a misdemeanor after 13 years from the time they were in drug court. With that 8% reduction, it would reduce it down to about 54%. So that's a small gain. It's a statistically significant gain. It's one of those small effects. Now, the proponents of drug courts, and maybe we all hoped that it would reduce crime rates by 80%, not 8%. Your heart may say, I really want this thing to work 80%, but our meta-analytic head is going to say, I think it's only going to work 8%. And in fact, when we've evaluated 6 of the drug courts in Washington, that's roughly right about the same number we got when we actually did a comparison group evaluation of our own drug courts in our state. So about 8% is what you can assume for drug courts. Now that 8% generates benefits. It generates about $4,700 of net benefit. We think it costs about $4,300 more to run drug courts compared to regular drug courts. You've got to pay for the treatment. You've got to pay for more prosecutorial time, judge time, public defender time. But the benefits of that 8% generates about $9,100 in benefits to taxpayers and to crime victims. So the net benefit looks like it's a pretty good resource for us for adult offenders who would qualify for drug courts. I'm not going to go through all these, of course, but we have a number of programs that we think have been shown to be reasonably effective in the adult system. Again, we meta-analyze those results. I show the number of studies there and the average effect that we have for those programs. You see, for intensive supervision, probation, or parole, where the primary focus is surveillance, not treatment for adult offenders, just counting contacts, 23 studies that we found, many of those were random assignment studies done by Peter Greenwood, who's here, and his former RAND colleagues. No effect on recidivism rates. So if you're spending money on that intensive supervision, you may be doing it for other reasons, but don't expect it to reduce the crime rate or recidivism rate of the offenders. For the juvenile offender programs, I've listed some of them here. Many of these are the blueprint programs: functional family therapy, multisystemic treatment, foster care. And many of those look very attractive to us. Those are our estimates. Those are the estimates that we go in to in terms of the percentage reduction in those crime outcomes that are so central to this study, and then the benefits to cost. And the benefits to cost are pretty much greater because those kids are in some of their high crime years. So if you got a 10% reduction on high crime years, you're actually going to be avoiding more crimes, not only during the juvenile years, but into their adult years as well, we think. So that's partly the reason why those benefits are so high. And then we had some prevention programs that have been successful at measuring crime outcomes as well. Preschool for low-income youth is an area, and then the Nurse-Family Partnership Program that everyone knows about here is another one that just from the crime output alone looks very attractive to us. I did not include in this one the child welfare and education outcomes that David Olds has observed there. This is just the crime outcomes and the prorated part of his cost that would be related to the crime. So those are the individual things. Those were when Frederick looks at all those pirates. Here's the pirates, but we like these pirates, except for ISP surveillance. So these are good investments. The question that we had now for our legislature is putting those together into a portfolio. In the 2007 legislature, in our report, what we did is we put together some sample portfolios. We took the programs that were the best programs. We went through a very laborious process of trying to figure out how many people in our state, for example, would qualify for functional family therapy. We're already running the program, so first we had to say how many people are we already serving on an intent-to-treat basis for functional family therapy. What's the total size of the market, if you will, of kids that are coming into juvenile court? We had to forecast the size of that market. And then what % of that market do we think we could logically or hope to attract? And generally, we took about 20% of the untapped market for our moderate case, 40% for the aggressive case, and for the current portfolio that I'll talk about, it was just the existing case. So we did that for each of the programs that we wanted to put into our portfolio. We put some adult offender programs in, prison education, and so on. Most all of the blueprint programs that have crime outcomes were part of the portfolio, and some prevention programs as well. Here's where we were in Washington. We're looking out from 28 to 2030. We're going to look at our prison supply and demand. We have about an 18,000 bed system, and we also purchased some capacity from local governments. And here was that forecast that I mentioned earlier, the December 2006 prison bed forecast. We were looking at needing to build in December of 2006, a little over a year ago, 2 prisons by 2020. We built them in units of about 2,000 in Washington State, and one other one by 2030. So that's what we were looking at. And the task that the legislature had asked the Institute is, how can you move that red line? What portfolios could you put together, and what would Washington look like if we did those portfolios? So I'm going to put some numbers up here, some of which you may be able to see, some of which you may not. I don't know. It's a big room. Here's the current level portfolio. If we just keep doing what we're doing now, and we're already doing a fair number of programs, not at a very high level, but we're getting a number of kids into juvenile programs. We're doing adult offender programs on occasion, and some prevention as well. We think that that red line would come down a little bit more because our state agency that does the forecast doesn't anticipate the continued implementation of those programs. And we think that the crime rate would go down from 52 crimes down to 48, in part because would be otherwise building a whole bunch of new prison beds. But that portfolio was going to save taxpayers about $1.1 billion and give a very handsome rate of return. So at a minimum, we want to keep doing what we're doing now in terms of those programs. But then we looked at the moderate implementation program, where again, we tried to tap 20% of the market for each of those programs. So for functional family therapy, we said, let's get 20% of the kids that we are not currently serving, let's get funding, and what would that cost, and then what would the benefits be? And we see that when we did a moderate portfolio, we took one of those prisons off the drawing board. We would reduce that forecast by cut it in half, and with an aggressive portfolio, with serving about 40% of the market for most of those programs, we could virtually eliminate the need to build new prison capacity. We would need some in the intervening years, but by the time the aggregate effects of some of those programs began to take hold, we would reduce the need to build new prison capacity, ceteris paribus, everything else being equal. That mainly the sentencing laws passed by the legislature. So in a couple of the numbers, they're significant, is the crime rate at the bottom. The crime rate would go down, and it would go down to be about the same under all three of those portfolios. So remember, we think prison, even at the levels that Washington is at, can reduce the crime rate. We just build the 2 or 3 extra prison beds and increase our incarceration rate. That's going to lower the crime rate. So we're going to enjoy lower crime in the state of Washington. But if we substituted some of those prisons with some of the programs that are in our portfolio, that would also reduce the crime rate, and we'll have about the same crime rate as if we had built the prisons. So the distinction, in my mind at least, is what portfolio you want to put together. You're going to get lower crime rates either way you do it. And it comes out on economics. So the economics of these programs, many of which we're talking about at this conference, are a lot cheaper than building the prison cells. So we can keep crime rates down, and we can spend a lot fewer of the taxpayer dollars keeping those crime rates down by doing a portfolio of the kinds of programs that are being talked about here and in the adult system, and some other programs that are not on the blueprints list either as well. So that was a revelation to us. We also did another analysis that showed that about 60% of the solution of getting the need for reduced prison is on the juvenile and prevention side. If you're just focusing, as I said earlier, on adult offender reentry, you can make a dent in some of those curves there. You can lower them, but it's not nearly as big a dent as you can if you focus on the juveniles and increase those portfolios. So that was a real eye-opener that we learned when we did this program. So the legislature actually funded the moderate portfolio. The moderate portfolio, they funded a combination of adult, juvenile, and prevention programs that are going to land us, we think, roughly on what that blue line is there. And as a result of that, in June of '07, so a little bit less than a year ago, the official state forecast of prison beds was lowered in Washington, down to that blue line. So it put Washington on the hook. We're now going to have to deliver those programs. We've got to ramp them up, and we've got a whole process underway. I won't go into too much of that today. It's a great story, but we're now trying to figure out how are we going to deliver those programs, how are we going to deliver them with fidelity, and how are we going to hold the agencies accountable to the legislature and to the governor for making sure that those people go into the juveniles and adults go into those programs and that we're delivering them and getting the effect sizes that we're after. Because the state has now made a bet. It's taken off one of those prisons off the building block, and now we have to deliver. So that's the good news from the 2007 session of the Washington legislature is that some of this information was used and a substantial change was made to the outlook for Washington, and we're going to have to see how we do implement it. So just returning to our themes a little bit here, we know now individually that Frederick was right, that some things look very good. You know, we can just wonderful rates of returns that on Wall Street today would be envious, especially today. It would be, well, maybe yesterday it would have been. Yet today, I don't know what's happening. Collectively, this is the thing that I think we did in this work that was certainly an eye-opener to me and influenced our legislature quite a bit. Collectively, if you think about all this stuff, not as individual programs, but what could your state do or your local community do if you did a whole portfolio of these things, where would you be? What we found is some very encouraging news in terms of some big statewide aggregates like crime rates, how much money we have to spend, how many prisons we have to build, those kinds of things. And so that leads us then to the decisions, some of which were made, as I mentioned, by the 2007 legislature, and then the restructuring of systems. So the actions already taken are underway in Washington. I think we've kind of made this leap to comprehensive resource portfolios. We know now that it doesn't do much good to just look at the silos, just to look at one system in isolation. You've got to do a planning exercise where you look at all the resources for an outcome that's common to all of them, like crime fighting, for example. And you can only do that by that kind of modeling approach, I think, that leads you to some conclusions that you might otherwise have been unaware of as opportunities. Our legislature was pretty excited about this report and acted on it. So we're now doing work in K-12 education, child welfare, developmental disabilities, and some other areas where mental health and substance abuse, where we're applying this same kind of concept of evidence-based review followed by economic analysis, followed by portfolio analysis. So the state's moving ahead on other areas as well as the crime area. I think some of the key things that lie ahead of us here are in the coordination of state and local efforts, especially in Washington and maybe in your states as well. For evidence-based programs, the way we've got around this, usually local governments view the state as the big bad state, dictating things, unfunded mandates, all that stuff. And the way we've tried to get around that in Washington, I think it's working, I hope successfully, is that the state adopts one of these evidence-based lists that we just talked about. The juvenile courts have this list of programs that they can implement if they want to have access to these funds, some funds. And the state and local governments can choose from that list. So there's enough programs on there so that the programs can be used depending on how they want to do it. If they're having trouble finding a market for the social workers to run FFT, then there's some other juvenile justice programs that can be run. So that's the general approach that the state is trying to evolve, that the state will have a list, it will have enough things on it so that local governments can then decide which of those programs they want to do. The second element is one that I will call research and development. In the private sector, we would call this research and development. General Motors has a research and development budget. Google has a research and development budget, a bigger budget for them. Every board of directors has to decide this. And so for new ideas, things that aren't evidence-based yet, but ideas typically that bubble up that local government wants to try, what the state did in Washington is it puts a pot of money out there and says you can apply for these funds. The only requirement is that we were going to have an evaluation, an honest evaluation of that, a rigorous evaluation, so that we'll know in a few years whether your good idea could make that evidence-based list or not. So the research and development funding level has also been set by the state for which the local governments can apply, and that applies for both the juvenile system and the adult system as well. Formal statewide assessment tools is also an integral part, I think, to this whole approach. I think it's been shown pretty clearly in the research literature that if you don't get the right person or the right adult or juvenile into these programs, the programs aren't going to likely work as well. And if you don't use a formal assessment to help make that determination, then you're more likely to get program drift, because you're probably not over time going to be serving the kinds of individuals in the program that you want. So we've instituted a number of assessment tools, formal needs, risk and needs assessment tools in both our juvenile system and now in our adult system as well. And we're going to try, and we are tying program participation to what's on those assessment tools. And finally, quality assurance. We've talked about that around here at this conference. We've also done analysis of quality assurance in Washington State for FFT and regression replacement training. We find it critical. If you don't have quality assurance, if you aren't hiring the right therapists and keeping the right therapists, then we think FFT on average doesn't work. That's what we found. On average, FFT didn't work when we tried it. But we did a random assignment. We had a blind reviewer of those therapists that did FFT according to the Jim Alexander's book. And when we did that, we found that it was working just as well for those therapists as we would anticipate it working. So when we learned that, we said we really do need to have quality assurance. And the way that's being done in Washington State is that some of the funds that the legislature sends out to the local juvenile courts are kept in Olympia to hire quality assurance personnel who go around and check all the therapists that are doing FFT and the other programs that we're currently funding. So it's a statewide effort at quality assurance And we got to evaluate how well that's working, but I have quite a bit of confidence in the people that are currently involved in that quality assurance effort. But it's a critical thing. In fact, I think, you know, if we don't think we're getting that, then I got to change that prison forecast. I got to move it back up. So it's something that we're going to be watching very closely as time goes on. And then finally, funding formulas. Funding formulas. We need to have state and local government take ownership of these programs. And increasingly, we've got more work to do on this topic than any of the other topics probably, but we want to get the funding formulas that some of those benefits stay local, some of them go to the state system in terms of budget, who has to pass those budgets. And we want to use these model that we've created to try to set up those funding formulas so that the benefits are roughly matched with those who have to vote on the decision-making process. So that action is also underway in the state of Washington. So there's our report. It's a dumb-looking government report. As Del said, I've been doing this for 31 years, so I know how to do dumb-looking government reports. I've learned that. But what it really is, of course, there's another report that produces information. This was the 2005 annual auto issue, exclusive reliability ratings of more than 1,100 cars. Because I'm from Washington, the land of Bill Gates, let's just do a little. Annual criminal justice issue, exclusive ratings, over 200 crime-related programs and policies. Let's get that car out of there. Put the capital. Best 2008 crime policies to adopt. Updated unbiased ratings of 222 models. We'll make that programs, best and worst programs. Don't get ripped off, save thousands of taxpayers' dollars, best programs. That's what our report really is. That's it. It's the same kind of information. If I hadn't, you know, if I'd wanted to get fired, I would have done it that way or sued by Consumer Reports. So instead, I made it look like that. But the kind of stuff that's in there is in there. And finally, let me just close that's a report. That's just a report. And people, I think as Clay mentioned yesterday, people make decisions, reports don't. And so I put the picture of Olympia up there again. It's important to note that these reports or analyses or the blueprint documents, they feed into a process that includes people, real live people, senators, representatives, governors, agency directors, local government people, advocates, all kinds of people. And those are the people that make decisions. So, and I'm not going to talk about today because we don't have time, but we could talk about some other time or over drinks or something. The people processes that have to go on, that had to go on in the state of Washington to move policy forward. So it's just a report. It says, here's some options that you can do that look pretty good, look like they would be good bets. This collectively, this group of programs here at Blueprints, adding some other programs that we think work, could make quite a difference for the people of the state of Washington, but it actually turns out to be the people, key members of the thousands of people that gather each year for the legislative session. There probably were 30 or 40 people that were instrumental in making the changes that Washington made in 2007 and in the other years. So sometime we'll be able to talk about the people stuff, but at least you got the number stuff. I thank you very much for your time here.